Hi guys. Tonight, we step into one of the most controversial corners of medieval history, the scandalous popes. Yes, popes who broke vows, stirred political chaos, and lived lives far from holy. Some ruled with power, others with greed, and a few with shocking secrets. Before we dive deeper, if you truly enjoy these calming history journeys, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where and when you re-listening. It's always fascinating to see who shares these nights together. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's uncover the hidden scandals of the medieval church. In the year 955 AD, the Papal States found themselves under the rule of a man who was, by all accounts, far more suited to the tavern and the battlefield than the sacred throne of St. Peter. His name was Octavian, a young nobleman of just 18 years old, and he was elected to the papacy as Pope John XII. The choice was less about divine inspiration and more about pure, unadulterated nepotism. His father Alberic II had dominated Rome's political landscape with a firm iron fist, and on his deathbed, he had his nobles and clergy swear a solemn oath to make his son the next Pope, ensuring the family's continued grip on power. This was a Rome where papal authority was not a matter of piety, but of political dynasty. And the throne was simply another piece of a grand familial game. And so Octavian, a boy pope who had been raised in the lap of aristocratic luxury, was thrust into the holiest of offices. But he had little interest in the spiritual. His tastes ran to the secular, and in a very public and flamboyant way that scandalized the very foundations of the church. He transformed the Lateran Palace, the very heart of the Holy See, and a place of quiet reverence, from a sanctuary of prayer into a hub of debauchery and entertainment. The once sacred halls that were meant for pious contemplation now echoed with the sounds of drunken laughter, the clinking of goblets, and the clamor of dice hitting a table in an all-night gambling spree. The solemn rhythm of vespers and matins was replaced by nightly banquets heavy with wine and ale, where the Pope himself was said to have made toasts to the devil and pagan gods, openly mocking the faith he was meant to protect. The sacred treasury, which was meant to aid the poor and fund new churches, was instead used to bankroll his extravagant gambling habits and lavish parties, leaving the city's poor and its crumbling churches to fend for themselves. His disdain for clerical duty was so profound that he was said to have consecrated a bishop in a horse stable and performed ordinations for a bribe, further eroding the spiritual authority he was meant to embody. The stories and rumors that began to spread across Rome and beyond were not subtle whispers of minor indiscretions, but loud, audacious accusations that painted a picture of a man entirely devoid of moral restraint. It was said that he turned the Lateran Palace into a veritable brothel, engaging in acts of great lewdness with women from all walks of life, including his own father's mistress and even a visiting pilgrim who had come to Rome seeking spiritual guidance. He was accused of blinding his confessor for a perceived insult and brutally castrating a subdecant crimes that defied all sense of clerical decorum and Christian morality. These stories, though perhaps embellished by his enemies over time, were so numerous and so brazen that they became a part of his very identity, cementing his reputation as the whoremaster of the papacy. His excesses were so legendary that a contemporary chronicler, Liutprand of Cremona, wrote a detailed and scathing account of his reign, ensuring his infamy would endure for centuries. Liutprand's chronicles paint a vivid and horrifying picture of the Lateran Palace, during this time describing it not as a spiritual home, but as a cesspool of vice, where the faithful were replaced by concubines and the holy sacraments were used for unholy rituals. The scandal was a public spectacle, the whispers of the faithful turning into a loud, horrified roar. His actions, however, went beyond personal scandal and moral decay. He was a political and military figure, and a terrible one at that, driven by a volatile mix of recklessness and self-interest. His reign was marked by a series of ill-conceived alliances and military campaigns that plunged Rome into constant turmoil. At one point, seeking protection from the powerful King Berengar II, he summoned the German king Otto I to Rome, promising to crown him Holy Roman Emperor in exchange for military support. Otto, a devout and ambitious monarch, obliged. He marched his army south, defeated Berengar, and was crowned in a lavish ceremony by John XII himself. But upon Otto's departure, John XII, with his characteristic lack of foresight, promptly made a secret alliance with Berengar's son to plot against the very emperor he had just crowned. This act of blatant betrayal was not a subtle diplomatic move. It was a reckless gamble that infuriated one of the most powerful men in Europe, a man who saw himself as the protector of the Church. This treacherous act, this short-sighted political maneuver, proved to be his undoing, as it showed a profound disrespect for a power far greater than his own. Otto I, having received news of the Pope's treachery, returned to Rome with his army. He did not come as a friend, but as a judge. He convened a synod to formally investigate the allegations against the Pope, a synod that would prove to be the final reckoning for John XII. The list of charges was breathtaking in its scope. It included sacrilege, the selling of church offices, perjury, murder, and even the unholy act of drinking a toast to the devil, a charge so severe it suggested a direct pact with evil. Witnesses, including bishops, priests, and laymen, testified to his lewd behavior, his profane life, and his utter disrespect for the sacred duties of his office. They described a man who consecrated children as bishops and who celebrated Mass without receiving communion, all for personal gain or amusement. In a final desperate plea, John XII, hiding from Otto's forces, sent a message to the synod, threatening to excommunicate anyone who dared to elect a new pope in his place. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and his reputation was irreparable. The synod, with the full backing of Otto, unanimously deposed him, replacing him with Pope Leo VIII. John XII's reign, though brief, left a permanent and indelible stain on the papacy. He was a living embodiment of the pornocracy, a period of papal history, marked by a succession of morally corrupt popes who treated the Holy Office as a personal inheritance and a tool for their own self-aggrandizement. His life was a stark reminder of what could happen when the immense spiritual power of the Church fell into the hands of a man who saw it not as a sacred duty, but as a personal playground for his vices. The boy who was chosen for his lineage, not his piety, went down in history as one of the most scandalous figures ever to hold the papal title. His end was as dramatic as his life. He was reportedly caught in the act with a married woman and the jealous husband catching them beat him so severely that he died a few days later, a final fittingly sordid end to his infamous life. A story that would be whispered in the dark corners of medieval taverns for centuries to come. His death was not just the end of a man, but the culmination of a period of extraordinary papal corruption, setting the stage for the dramatic reforms that would follow. The sheer scale of his depravity shocked even his contemporaries and would serve as a powerful cautionary tale for the centuries to come, highlighting the dangers of allowing political ambition to overshadow spiritual responsibility. He was a testament to the fact that in the chaotic world of the medieval papacy, a line between divine authority and human depravity was often disturbingly thin. In the year 897 AD, the city of Rome was not a seat of peace and spiritual authority, but a chaotic and blood-soaked theater of political intrigue and violent feuds. At the center of this relentless turmoil was a macabre spectacle that would forever stain the reputation of the papacy and its members. It was a story so bizarre, so profoundly unsettling, and so utterly divorced from Christian piety that it seemed to belong not to the annals of holy history. but to a dark Gothic novel penned by a disturbed mind. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod, a moment of pure, unadulterated madness in the long history of the Church. The main protagonist of this ghastly affair was Pope Stephen VI, a man whose brief but infamous pontificate was driven by a single, burning obsession: the complete and utter damnation of his predecessor, Pope Formosus. To understand this consuming hatred, we must first look at the tangled web of Roman politics. Formosus had been a complicated figure, a skilled and ambitious diplomat who had at one point been excommunicated for political maneuvering, only to be reinstated and later, against all odds, elected pope. His time on the throne had been marked by a close and controversial alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, Arnulf of Carinthia, a powerful German ruler. This alliance put him at direct odds with the equally powerful and deeply entrenched Spalato family, a fierce Italian dynasty led by the ambitious Duke Lambert and his ruthless mother, Agiltrude. When Formosus died, the Spalatos, having finally regained a firm grip on Rome, saw a golden opportunity for vengeance. They elevated Stephen VI, a puppet of their faction who shared their burning animosity towards the dead pope, to the papacy. But for Stephen and the Spalatos, the death of Formosus was not enough. His memory had to be erased, his actions condemned, and his legacy obliterated, as if he had never existed. Stephen was driven by a fanatic, almost insane hatred that transcended mere political rivalry. He declared that Formosus's election to the papacy was invalid, a sacrilege against all holy law because of his past excommunication. However, church law, even in this tumultuous era, stated that a living pope could not be judged. So, in a move of unprecedented and chilling horror, Stephen ordered that the body of Formosus be exhumed from its tomb. The corpse, which had been decaying in its grave for 9 long months, was dragged from the crypt, cleaned as best as possible, and dressed in the full, magnificent papal vestments. It was then brought to the Lateran Basilica, the very heart of the Church's power in Rome, and propped up on a throne in front of a horrified synod of bishops and a bewildered, whispering Roman populace. The scene that followed was one of nightmarish surrealism and profound sacrilege. Before the terrified assembly, the silent, decomposing cadaver of Formosus sat in judgment. Its glassy eyes stared blankly ahead, a grotesque parody of papal authority. Stephen VI himself, his face contorted with rage, acted as both the prosecutor and the judge, screaming accusations at the cadaver in a voice that echoed through the vast, cold halls of the basilica. The accusations were mostly technical, focusing on the charge that Formosus had violated church canons by moving from the bishopric of Portus to the See of Rome, a relatively minor offense that paled in comparison to the blasphemous proceedings unfolding before them. A young deacon, pale with fear and visibly shaking, was forced to stand behind the corpse and answer for the dead pope, a grotesque ventriloquist act that made a mockery of justice and human decency. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of fear, shock, and revulsion as the living raged against the dead. It was a spectacle of political theater, so twisted and depraved that it defied all reason. The verdict was, of course, a foregone conclusion. The lifeless defendant was found guilty. In a twisted mockery of papal law, Formosus's pontificate was declared null and void. The papal vestments, which had been so carefully placed on the rotting body, were violently stripped from it, and in a final, symbolic act of desecration, the 3 fingers of his right hand that he had used for blessings were brutally cut off with a knife. The body was then dragged out of the basilica, through the narrow, horrified streets of Rome, a grotesque puppet on a string, and eventually thrown into the Tiber River, a final resting place for a man who had once been the most powerful religious leader in the world. The river became his new tomb, his body meant to be washed away and forgotten forever. a final public humiliation. This act of public desecration was meant to be a final and total humiliation, a clear and brutal message to all of Rome and Christendom that the legacy of Formosus was dead and buried. But it had the opposite effect. The people of Rome were not cowed. They were profoundly horrified and disgusted. The sight of a dead man being put on trial and desecrated in such a manner was too much. Even for a populace accustomed to political violence and intrigue, the Cadaver Synod became a moral tipping point. A strong and righteous backlash emerged against Stephen VI and the Spoleto faction. The public outrage was so immense and so widespread that within a year, a popular uprising led to Stephen's imprisonment. He was later strangled to death in his cell. A fittingly violent end for a man who had orchestrated such a violent and blasphemous act. The story of Formosus did not end there, however. A devout monk, horrified by the disrespect shown to the body, recovered it from the Tiber and gave it a proper burial. Later popes, in a bid to restore some semblance of papal authority and dignity, eventually annulled the Cadaver Synod, condemning the entire affair as a horrific miscarriage of justice and sacrilege. The body was reinterred in St. Peter's Basilica with all the honors befitting a pope. A final posthumous victory for Formosus. The story of the Cadaver Synod is a terrifying and unforgettable example of how deep political rivalries and personal vendettas had corrupted the papacy. It shows a world where the spiritual office was not a source of divine grace, but a tool for ruthless political power. A world where the dead could be put on trial, and the holy could be treated with such utter and profound disrespect. It is a moment of pure madness in the long history of the Church, a spectacle that serves as a chilling reminder of the darkest extremes of human ambition and hatred. This event stood as a stark monument to the so-called Dark Age of the papacy, a time when the very soul of the Church seemed to be lost in the shadowy, cutthroat world of temporal power. It was an event so shocking that it would become a whispered legend, a cautionary tale for future generations of clerics who dared to put personal gain above their sacred vows. It truly was the stuff of nightmares made real. The synod's echoes would continue to haunt the halls of the Church for decades. As a symbol of the depths to which political infighting could descend, the echoes of the Cadaver Synod had barely faded from the halls of Rome, the memory of Pope Formosus's desecrated body still haunting the streets. When the city's political stage prepared for yet another act of unholy drama, the central character in this new spectacle was a man of the Spoleto faction. A staunch supporter of the Cadaver Synod named Sergius. He was a man with a burning ambition and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of Pope Stephen VI's actions against Formosus. He had watched from the shadows as the papal throne became a revolving door of short-lived pontiffs, each attempting to reverse the decisions of their predecessors, and he saw his opportunity. When the time came, he would seize the papal throne and usher in a new dark era of papal history, one defined not just by political intrigue, but by sheer unchecked power, fueled by a powerful new kind of Roman aristocracy. This is the story of Pope Sergius III, a man who would become a symbol of the darkest period of the papacy. The papacy during this period was in a state of utter disarray, a political football tossed between competing factions of Roman nobles, each vying for control of the immense wealth and spiritual authority of the Church. After the death of Stephen VI, the office of the Pope changed hands rapidly. There was a brief period where the Cadaver Synod was annulled, and Formosus's reputation was restored by a series of short-lived popes. But this fragile peace was not to last. Sergius, with the backing of his powerful allies, saw an opportunity to seize control. He launched a ruthless campaign, and in the year 904, with the full and unwavering support of Theophylact I, the Count of Tusculum, and his notoriously ambitious wife, Theodorus Sergius was installed as pope. His first act as pontiff was a testament to his character and his allegiances. He had the body of the pope who had annulled the cadaver synod exhumed from its tomb and his edicts burned, a public show of contempt for his predecessors. In an act that shocked even the hardened Romans, he reinstated the judgments of the cadaver synod, reaffirming the condemnation of Formosus. The cadaver synod was not just an isolated incident. It was a ghost that haunted the papacy, and Sergius had just brought it back from the grave, a clear signal that the politics of vengeance were far from over. But the story of Sergius III is more than a tale of political vengeance. It is a story of a new kind of power emerging in Rome, a power based not on old noble titles or imperial favor, but on the raw, corrupting influence of wealth and family. Sergius was said to be not just an ally, but a lover of Marozia, the daughter of Theophylact and Theodora. Marozia was a woman of legendary beauty, intellect, and ruthlessness. She was a master of political manipulation. Pulling the strings of power from behind the scenes, her influence a whispered legend among the city's elite. She would become the de facto ruler of Rome, and her power, exerted through her alliances and her cunning, was absolute. The relationship between Sergius and Marozia was a scandalous open secret, and it produced a son who would later go on to become Pope John XI, a living testament to this unholy union. The Lateran Palace, once again, became a den of immorality. Its sacred halls, a stage for a grand opera of sin and intrigue, where political decisions were made in the bedroom and alliances were sealed with depraved acts. The papacy was now a family business, and its currency was not faith, but political loyalty, forbidden love, and the promise of endless power. This period, often called the pornocracy, saw the papacy's reputation plummet to its lowest point, as the Holy See became a pawn in the hands of a few powerful families. The reign of Sergius III, though relatively short, was marked by a complete lack of spiritual leadership. He was a political and military figure, first and foremost concerned with consolidating his power and enriching his allies. He used the immense wealth of the church to build new fortifications and to fund his political campaigns. He filled the key positions of the church with his loyal supporters and family members, creating a network of corruption that would persist for generations. The people of Rome, accustomed to the scandals of their popes, were now witnessing a new low. The spiritual vacuum was so complete that the pope's primary concern seemed to be his own personal power and the advancement of his family. He was a man who saw the church not as a divine institution, but as a kingdom to be ruled, and he ruled it with an iron hand. His actions were a mirror of his ruthless soul, a testament to how far a man of God could fall when blinded by ambition. Sergius was not a man of subtle diplomacy. He ruled with an iron fist, and his enemies were dealt with swiftly and brutally. He had his opponents imprisoned, exiled, or murdered. His brutality was not a secret. It was a tool he used to maintain control. The atmosphere in Rome was one of constant fear and paranoia. The city had become a battleground, and the Pope was one of the chief warlords, a military leader cloaked in papal vestments. His pontificate was a stark contrast to the divine authority he was meant to represent. He was a politician, a warlord, and a figure of scandal, all rolled into one. His time on the papal throne would be remembered not for any great spiritual achievements, but for the profound corruption and moral decay he brought to the office. His name would forever be associated with the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age, where the spiritual light of the Church was almost completely extinguished by the shadows of political power and moral decay. The story of Sergius III is a window into the darkest period of papal history. It shows how the papacy, stripped of its spiritual authority, became a mere pawn in the ruthless political games of the Roman aristocracy. It is a story of a man who used a sacred office for profane purposes, and of a woman whose power, though unseen, was the true force that guided the destiny of the Holy See. It is a tragic tale that shows how far the Church had fallen from its spiritual ideals, and how deeply it had become entangled in the web of human greed and ambition. The reign of Sergius III would be a symbol of the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age where the papacy was at its lowest point. A time when the very soul of the Church seemed to be lost in the shadowy, cutthroat world of temporal power, all guided by a man who was in his heart more of a warlord than a spiritual leader. His legacy would be one of profound moral decay, and a stark reminder that in the absence of piety, power corrupts absolutely. His actions paved the way for a generation of morally compromised popes, all controlled by the powerful Theophylact family. And his son's eventual ascent to the papal throne would prove that the line between the sacred and the profane had been all but erased, leaving a void that would take centuries to fill. The moral stain of his reign was so deep that even his death did little to cleanse the air of corruption. The first half of the 11th century saw Rome still reeling from the chaos of the previous era. The pornocracy had faded, but its legacy of corruption, nepotism, and political puppetry remained, a deep-seated rot that had infected the very soul of the Church. The papacy had become a commodity, a prize to be won by the most powerful Roman families, and its spiritual authority was nothing more than a convenient facade for their temporal ambitions. And no single figure embodied this moral decay more completely than a young man from the house of Tusculani, a man who would become Pope Benedict IX. His pontificate was not a single reign, but a series of bizarre and unprecedented ascensions and falls, a saga so filled with vice and drama that it beggars belief. He holds the dubious distinction of being one of the youngest popes in history. The only man to have been pope on 3 separate occasions, and the only man to have sold the papacy to his godfather. Born Theophylactus, the nephew of the powerful counts of Tusculum, he was thrust into the holiest of offices at an age so young that historians still debate it. Some say he was as young as 11 or 12, others 14, but all agree he was a mere boy, still in the throes of a volatile adolescence. The year was 1032. His family, using their immense wealth and military might, simply installed him on the throne. This was not a spiritual election. It was a hostile takeover, a calculated move in a grand political chess game. The young Theophylactus was a product of his time and his family, entitled, attire-hungry, and utterly unconcerned with the spiritual duties of his new role. He took the name Benedict IX, and with it the keys to a kingdom he had no intention of ruling with piety. From the very beginning, his pontificate was a catastrophe, a continuous spectacle of sacrilege and debauchery. He had no interest in theology or the sacred rites of the Church. His life was a continuous spiral of depravity, a blur of drunken nights and public scandal. Contemporary chroniclers, even those sympathetic to the papacy, were left stunned by his actions. The monk Rodelphus Glaber described him as living a life so shameful, so foul, so execrable, that I trembled to relate it. Benedict IX turned the Lateran palace into a den of vice. He was said to have indulged in lewd banquets, orgies, and all manner of profanity. Tales of his sexual immorality were widespread and brazen. He was accused of a series of murders, rapes, and acts of assault, his behavior more akin to a Roman emperor of old, a Nero or a Caligula, than the Vicar of Christ. He sold church offices to the highest bidder, a practice known as simony, openly profaning the very sacraments of the Church for personal gain, and turning holy orders into a form of high-stakes gambling. The holy city of Rome became a dangerous place under his rule, a city where the Pope himself was the greatest source of fear and moral corruption, and the people lived in constant dread of his unpredictable, violent whims. The Roman people, for all their jaded tolerance of papal misconduct, had reached their breaking point. The moral vacuum left by his reign was too much to bear. In 1044, a popular revolt, fueled by disgust and righteous anger, erupted. The people, unable to bear his tyranny and immorality any longer, rose up and drove Benedict IX out of the city in a frantic flight. He fled in terror, but his family, the Tusculani, was not so easily defeated. They had a new pope elected, one of their own, Sylvester III, who they hoped would be a more stable pawn in their game. But this would only be the beginning of a truly chaotic chapter, as the rival factions of Rome plunged the city into a new era of bloodshed and confusion. Benedict IX, with the military support of his powerful family, returned to Rome with a vengeance just a few months later. He stormed the city, seized the Lateran Palace, and violently expelled Sylvester III, who fled for his life. This marked his second, brief stint as pope, but the chaos was far from over. His behavior had not improved, and the city was once again in turmoil, caught between the feuding families. The sheer instability of his rule, combined with his continuous acts of moral outrage, led to a desperate and unprecedented solution. The very idea of the papacy was at stake, and something drastic had to be done to save it from itself. In a move that defies all logic and religious protocol, Benedict IX decided to sell the papacy. He had grown weary of the constant political strife, the endless feuds, and perhaps even the responsibilities of the office. He was also reportedly contemplating marriage, a final sacrilege to the office he held. He approached his godfather, a devout and respected priest named John Gratian, who was horrified by the state of the church and by the Pope's actions. John Gratian, believing that the only way to save the papacy was to remove this corrupted figure, agreed to buy the position. He paid a hefty sum, an act of simony in a twisted deal to end an even greater act of sacrilege. Upon the exchange of money, Benedict IX abdicated and rode off to enjoy his ill-gotten gains, leaving the future of the church in the hands of a man who had purchased its highest office. John Gratian, now the new pope, took the name Gregory VI, but the story of Benedict IX was not yet finished. His departure left Rome in an even greater state of confusion. Now there were three men claiming the title of pope. Benedict IX, who had a change of heart and decided he wanted the throne back. Sylvester III, who had never fully accepted his deposition. And Gregory VI, the man who had bought the papacy in a desperate attempt to reform it. This three-way schism plunged the church into an abyss of crisis. The papacy had been reduced to a bargaining chip, a prize for sale to the highest bidder. Its spiritual authority completely dissolved, and its very purpose lost in a sea of greed and ambition. The faithful of Europe looked on in horror, wondering if the church itself was collapsing. The situation was so dire that the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III, was compelled to intervene. In 1046, he marched to Rome and convened the Synod of Sutri, a council of bishops and abbots. He swiftly deposed all three rival popes, declaring their claims to be illegitimate. He then had a German bishop elected, who took the name Clement II. It was a brutal but necessary act to restore order to the exor, and to reaffirm the authority of the emperor over the papacy. Benedict IX, once again deposed, was left without his throne. He would attempt one final, desperate return. After the death of Clement II, Benedict IX, ever persistent, once again seized the papal throne for a third time, but his reign was incredibly brief. He was swiftly removed, and this time he finally gave up the fight for good. He retreated from public life and, in a shocking and final twist, seemed to undergo a genuine conversion. He retired to a monastery, living out his days in quiet piety and penitence, a quiet, humble end to a life of extraordinary scandal. He died around 1055, a former man of incredible vice who found a final, peaceful redemption. The story of Benedict IX stands as a grim testament to the absolute depths to which the papacy had sunk during this era. His life was a bizarre and terrifying reflection of a world where spiritual authority had been completely swallowed by political corruption and personal immorality. His unique place in history as a child pope, a three-time pontiff, and the pope who sold his office serves as a powerful and shocking symbol of a time when the moral and spiritual fabric of the church had almost completely unraveled. His story is not just a scandal. 'Tis a profound cautionary tale about the perils of allowing power to corrupt the very soul, and about the long, dark road a man must travel to find his way back to light. The saga of the Cadaver Synod did not end with the drowning of a dead man's corpse in the Tiber River. It was merely the opening act of a much larger, more twisted play that would plunge the papacy into its darkest, most depraved era yet. A period later dubbed the pornocracy. The moral outrage and public disgust caused by Stephen VI.'s grotesque trial of Pope Formosus had a swift and brutal consequence. The people of Rome, having witnessed the ultimate sacrilege, were no longer afraid of a man who would defile the dead. They were filled with a righteous anger that demanded justice. Stephen, the orchestrator of the ghastly spectacle, was not a spiritual figure to them. He was a monster. The mob, in a righteous fury, stormed the Lateran Palace, seized Stephen VI, and threw him into prison. There, in the darkness of his cell, a fittingly violent end awaited him. He was strangled to death, his life snuffed out by the very people he had tried to intimidate with his show of power. The swiftness and brutality of his end was a clear message to all of Rome. The game of sacrilege had gone too far, and the people would not tolerate it any longer. His legacy was one of infamy, a final, fittingly sordid chapter for a man who had shown such contempt for the dead and the holy. With Stephen gone, the papacy became an even more contested prize. The Spoleto faction, though powerful, found themselves on the defensive, and the office changed hands in a dizzying succession of popes, each ruling for only a few months or a year. This instability was a symptom of the deep-seated corruption that had taken root. The anti-Spoleto faction, led by the supporters of Formosus, rushed to restore the honor of the martyred pope. The body of Formosus, miraculously recovered from the river by a sympathetic monk, was reinterred with full papal honors in St. Peter's Basilica, and the Cadaver Synod was officially annulled. For a moment, it seemed that the Church might return to some semblance of order and spiritual dignity. But this was merely a temporary lull before a storm of unprecedented corruption. The true power was not in the hands of the popes, but in the hands of a new, formidable family dynasty that had risen from the chaos, the House of Theophylact. At its head stood Theophylact I, the Count of Tusculum. A man of immense wealth and political cunning, but the true masterminds behind the scenes were his wife, Theodora, and his daughter, Marozia. Theodora was a force of nature, a woman of legendary beauty and even more legendary ambition. She had no qualms about using her influence, her wealth, and her formidable intelligence to place her puppets on the papal throne. She and her daughter Marozia would become the real rulers of Rome, pulling the strings of the Holy See like a pair of puppeteers in a grotesque play. The papacy, once a symbol of spiritual authority, was now an extension of their political will. They were the architects of the pornocracy, a period where the popes were little more than pawns in a game of sex, power, and dynasty. The Lateran Palace was no longer a place of spiritual contemplation, but a gilded cage where the popes were held captive by the whims of these powerful women. The spiritual integrity of the Church was completely swallowed by the ruthless ambition of this family. and their influence would be felt for decades to come, poisoning the very foundations of the Holy See, turning it from a beacon of faith into a den of corruption. The rise of Marozia marked the pinnacle of this new era. She was a woman of extraordinary beauty and an even greater ruthlessness. A character straight out of a Machiavellian treatise, she was not content to merely pull the strings from behind the scenes. She wanted to be seen as the ultimate power in Rome, the queen of the eternal city. She used her relationships with the popes to solidify her family's control over the city and the church. She was the lover of Pope Sergius III, who we discussed in the previous scene, and their illegitimate son would later become Pope John XI, a living testament to this unholy union. Her power was so absolute that no man could be elected pope without her approval. She was the one who decided who would wear the papal tiara. And her choices were always driven by her family's political ambitions, not by any spiritual qualifications. The papacy was now her family's inheritance, a right that was passed down through generations, often through illicit means, a clear sign of how far the church had fallen from its spiritual ideals. Marozia's ultimate goal was to make her family the sole rulers of Rome, and she saw the papacy as the key to achieving this. She was a master of political marriages, marrying into the most powerful families in Italy to strengthen her alliances. Her actions were not just political, they were personal and deeply corrupt. She was a woman who saw power as the ultimate prize, and she would stop at nothing to get it. She even imprisoned her own son, Pope John XI, when he became too independent, a testament to her cold and calculated ambition. The scandals of this era were no longer just about the popes. They were about a family who had hijacked the very soul of the church for their own gain. The corruption was now systemic, a deep-seated rot that would take decades to cleanse. The moral compass of the church had been shattered, and its leaders were more concerned with worldly power than with divine salvation. This dark period, lasting for several decades, would see a succession of popes who were little more than puppets, their strings pulled by the powerful and immoral Theophylact family. The pornocracy was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. The church had become so entangled in the temporal world that its spiritual purpose had been completely lost. The popes were no longer seen as spiritual leaders, but as political figures, and their lives were a continuous source of scandal and intrigue. The reign of Pope John XI, Marozia's son, was a clear example of this. He was a pope in name only, a puppet whose actions were dictated by his ruthless mother. He was a pawn in a game of power that he could never hope to win, and his short, ineffective pontificate was a tragic reflection of the state of the church. The papacy had become a joke, and its moral authority had been completely eroded, leaving the faithful in a state of confusion and despair, wondering what had become of the spiritual institution they had once revered. The clergy, once seen as a bastion of moral authority, were now viewed with suspicion and contempt by the masses who could see the corruption for what it was. The saga of the pornocracy would eventually come to an end, but its legacy would last for centuries. It was a period that showed the world the darkest side of the church, a side filled with greed, corruption, and immorality. The stories of these scandalous popes, of Stephen VI's macabre trial, and Sergius III's unholy union, would serve as a powerful cautionary tale for future generations of clerics. They are a grim reminder that in the absence of piety, power corrupts absolutely, and that the line between the sacred and the profane is often thinner than we think. The tales of these scandalous popes would forever serve as a dark and haunting chapter in the history of the Church, a testament to a time when faith was a forgotten word and power was the only God. These scandals, so public and so widespread, would eventually lead to the great church reforms of the 11th century, a desperate attempt to restore the moral integrity of the papacy and reclaim its spiritual authority from the clutches of the corrupt Roman aristocracy. The very future of the Church depended on it. As the long-suffering Roman populace and the horrified clergy of Europe watched on, waiting for a savior who could cleanse the Augean stables of the papacy and lead it back to the path of righteousness. The dark age of the papacy had reached its zenith, and the only way forward was a painful, often brutal, process of reform that would forever change the face of the Church. The reign of Marozia and her family was the ultimate proof that the spiritual and the political could not coexist without one corrupting the other, and that the cost of wanton corruption was the very soul of the Church itself. As the medieval era faded and the Renaissance dawned, Europe was in the throes of a profound transformation. Art, science, and philosophy flourished, but in the heart of Rome, the old power games of the Dark Ages had simply been reborn with a new, glittering facade. The papacy, having survived the pornocracy and the tumultuous era of Benedict IX, was now a powerful political entity, a major player on the Italian stage. And no family symbolized this new era of papal power and corruption more completely than the Borgias. At the center of their story was a man of boundless ambition, a Spaniard named Rodrigo Borgia, who would, through a combination of cunning, charisma, and a staggering amount of simony, ascend to the papal throne as Pope Alexander VI. His pontificate was not just a scandal, it was an open theatrical display of vice, a grand opera of nepotism, murder, and political intrigue that would shock even his jaded contemporaries and forever cement the Borgia name in the annals of infamy. Rodrigo Borgia was not a man of piety. He was a master politician and a shrewd businessman. He was a brilliant lawyer who had risen through the ranks of the Church on the strength of his intellect and his family's connections. He was known for his charm, his magnetic personality, and his almost legendary taste for luxury. He was also a man who had fathered at least 7 illegitimate children, a fact that he made little effort to conceal. His election as Pope in 1492, upon the death of Pope Innocent VIII, was a public spectacle of corruption. The conclave was a whirlwind of bribery and promises. Rodrigo, with his immense wealth, bought the loyalty of his fellow cardinals, offering them riches, bishoprics, and positions of power. The very act of his election was a sacrilege, a clear and public act of simony, yet no one dared to challenge it. The man who would be pope had simply purchased the highest office in the Church. His election was a symbol of the spiritual bankruptcy of the era, a clear sign that the papacy was no longer a spiritual office, but a political prize to be won by any means necessary. The city of Rome held its breath as the results were announced, knowing that with a Borgia on the throne, the rules of the game had been irrevocably changed. Once on the throne, Alexander VI made no effort to hide his secular ambitions. He was a king in all but name, and the Papal States were his kingdom. His first and most enduring passion was the advancement of his family, particularly his children. His nepotism was so brazen and so absolute that it became the defining characteristic of his pontificate. His eldest son, Cesare Borgia, a man as ruthless as his father, was made a cardinal at a young age, only to later renounce his clerical vows to become a military commander. A papal general who would carve out a brutal and bloody kingdom for himself in central Italy. He was a man of cold, calculating ambition, a living embodiment of his father's dreams of a family dynasty. His daughter, Lucretia Borgia, a figure of beauty and controversy, was used as a political pawn, married off to a series of powerful men to secure alliances for her family. Her life was a tragic reflection of her family's ambition, as she was used, abused, and discarded in the ruthless pursuit of power. His children were not a secret. They were a public spectacle, a living, breathing testament to his complete disregard for the sacred vows of his office. He saw his children not as a burden, but as a political asset, a way to build a dynasty that would last for generations. The Papal States under Alexander VI became a battleground for the Borgia family's territorial ambitions. He used the Church's vast wealth and its spiritual authority as weapons to secure his family's position. The papal treasury, meant for the support of the poor and the missions of the Church, was instead used to fund Caesar's military campaigns, his lavish court, and his father's extravagant lifestyle. The Borgias were known for their opulence and their ruthless efficiency. They were feared and respected in equal measure. The name Borgia became synonymous with betrayal and murder. It was an open secret in Rome that the Borgia family would use poison to eliminate their enemies. A sinister rumor that was often whispered in the dark corners of the city's palaces. The most famous of these rumors was the use of the cantarella, a poison so potent it could kill a man in a matter of days. The deaths of a number of prominent cardinals and Roman nobles who stood in the way of the Borgia family's ambitions were often shrouded in an aura of suspicion and fear, with the public whispering that the Borgias had a hand in their demise. The Borgia name was enough to strike fear into the hearts of their rivals, and their cunning and ruthlessness were legendary. The moral decay of the Borgia pontificate was not just political, it was profoundly personal and spiritual. The Lateran palace was transformed into a den of vice, a place where orgies and debauchery were commonplace. The famous banquet of chestnuts, where 50 courtesans were said to have danced naked for the amusement of the Pope and his children, became a legendary symbol of their depravity. The sacred and the profane were no longer separate. They had become one. The Pope was no longer a spiritual leader. He was a king, a warlord, and a libertine who used his spiritual office as a tool for his own personal gain and the advancement of his family. The Church was a business, and the Borgias were the ultimate entrepreneurs, running it with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to their political and military campaigns. The corruption was so widespread that it was no longer a secret. It was a public spectacle, a show of power that left the faithful in a state of shock and despair. The Church had become a stage for the Borgia family's ambition, and the Pope was the star of the show. Alexander VI's reign would eventually come to an end in 1503, but not before he had left an indelible mark on the papacy. His death was as shrouded in mystery as his life. The common rumor was that he had accidentally consumed the very poison he and Caesar had prepared for a wealthy cardinal. A final, fittingly ironic end for a man who had used poison so often as a weapon. While this story is likely apocryphal, the fact that it was so widely believed speaks volumes about the reputation of the man and his family. The papacy, and indeed the entire Church, would be forever changed by his pontificate. His rule and the excesses of his family served as a powerful and undeniable symbol of the corruption that had infected the Church, paving the way for the coming storm of the Protestant Reformation. He was the ultimate scandalous pope, a man who, in his unholy ambition, had completely blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane, a man who had made a mockery of the very office he held. His life was a testament to the fact that power, when unchecked by piety, can lead to the darkest of places, and his legacy was a warning to all who would follow him that the road to power is paved with scandal, and that the cost of deep cowed, that power is the very soul of the Church itself. His pontificate was a final, brilliant, and terrifying example of how far a man of God could fall when he chose to serve himself, rather than his flock, a man who saw the papacy not as a sacred trust, but as a family inheritance to be exploited and abused for generations to come. The scandals we've chronicled weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a profound sickness within the Church, a deep-seated rot that had been festering for centuries. The cadaver synod, the pornocracy, the outrageous pontificate of Benedict IX, and the breathtaking corruption of the Borgias weren't just sensational stories. They were the slow, steady accumulation of moral failings that had completely eroded the papacy's spiritual authority. By the early 16th century, the Church had become a political and economic behemoth. But its spiritual heart was failing, and the faithful, from the highest nobles to the lowliest peasants, could feel it. The stage was set for a final, cataclysmic event. A storm that had been gathering for centuries and would forever change the face of Christianity. This is the story of the Reformation, the inevitable conclusion to the long, scandalous history of the medieval papacy. The culmination of these centuries of scandal was the pontificate of Pope Leo X, a man who, unlike his predecessors, was not a monster of vice, but a man of refined taste, a true Renaissance prince. He was a son of the powerful Medici family, a man who loved art, music, and lavish parties. His famous quote, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," perfectly encapsulates his worldview. He saw the papacy not as a spiritual office, but as a cultural institution, a source of personal pleasure and a means to fund his extravagant lifestyle and his family's artistic patronage. He was not evil, but his moral indifference and his focus on worldly pleasure were, in a way, more damaging than the overt wickedness of his predecessors. He was the perfect example of a papacy that had completely lost its spiritual compass, so preoccupied with worldly splendor that it could no longer see the moral decay beneath its feet. The final straw came in the form of indulgences. In order to fund the magnificent rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a project that was a testament to the Church's immense wealth and power, Pope Leo X launched a massive fundraising campaign. He authorized the sale of plenary indulgences, a form of spiritual pardon that promised the remission of sins, not only for the living, but for the dead. The sale was a crass commercial enterprise, with traveling salesmen like the infamous Johann Tetzel hawking these pardons with slogans like, "As soon as the gold in the casket rings, the rescued soul to heaven springs." It was a naked, transactional approach to salvation, a blatant profanation of the spiritual. For many people, this was not just a scandal. It was an unforgivable sacrilege, a final public betrayal of the faith that had been passed down for generations. The idea that salvation could be bought and sold, that a man's piety was less important than the contents of his purse, was an abomination. And in a small town in Germany, a quiet monk and professor named Martin Luther watched this spectacle with growing horror. He had studied the scriptures deeply, and he believed with all his heart that salvation could not be bought or sold. He believed that salvation was a gift from God, received through faith alone. The sale of indulgences was, to him, a clear and undeniable proof of the Church's corruption. In October 1517, he famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the All Saints' Church in Wittenberg. A list of complaints against the sale of indulgences and other church practices. This act, meant as a scholarly debate, was a spark that ignited a continent-wide inferno. The printing press, a new and powerful technology, spread his ideas across Europe with astonishing speed. His words resonated with a populace that was already disillusioned with a corrupt and distant papacy. They were tired of a church that demanded their money for the promise of salvation, a promise that felt hollow in the face of so much moral decay. Luther's rebellion was not a new idea. Jan Hus in Bohemia and John Wycliffe in England had tried to reform the church in the previous centuries, but their movements had been crushed. But now, with the corruption so blatant, the people were ready to listen. They were tired of a papacy that was more concerned with political power and personal wealth than with their spiritual well-being. They were tired of a clergy that lived in opulence while the faithful starved. They were tired of a church that treated salvation as a commodity. The time for a revolution had come. The long simmering resentment, fueled by centuries of scandal and neglect, finally boiled over. The Reformation was not just a theological dispute. It was a profound spiritual, social, and political upheaval. Kings and princes, who had long resented the Pope's authority, used the Reformation as a pretext to seize church lands and establish their own national churches free from Roman control. The social fabric of Europe was torn apart by religious wars that would rage for a century, pitting Christian against Christian in a bloody, brutal conflict. The unity of Christendom, which had been a defining feature of the medieval era, was shattered forever. The Church was broken, and it would never be whole again. The papacy, once the undisputed spiritual leader of the West, was now just one of many Christian denominations. Its authority questioned, its power diminished. The scandalous history of the medieval papacy, from the Cadaver Synod to the Borgias, was the deep-seated cause of this seismic event. These scandals were not just isolated acts of depravity. They were the slow, steady erosion of the Church's moral authority. The abuses of power, the rampant nepotism, the endless corruption, these were the wounds that had festered for centuries. And the sale of indulgences was the final fatal blow. The Reformation was a consequence, an inevitable outcome of a system that had become so corrupt that it had lost its way. The people had finally had enough, and they turned their backs on a church that had so openly betrayed them. The story of the scandalous popes is not just a tale of depravity and moral decay. It is a profound lesson in the consequences of unchecked power and the long, slow, and often painful road to reform. The very existence of the Protestant churches today is a testament to the power of that story. A constant and enduring reminder that when faith is forgotten and power is the only God, the very foundations of a great institution will inevitably crumble. We have journeyed through the darkest corridors of papal history, a turbulent and at times terrifying narrative of power, greed, and moral decay. We've witnessed the bizarre Cadaver Synod, where a dead man was put on trial, a macabre spectacle that revealed the utter depths of political vengeance. We've explored the pornocracy, a period when the papacy was held captive by a family of ruthless women, turning the Holy See into a pawn in their game of sex and power. We've seen the unbelievable reign of Benedict IX, a boy pope who was a king of vice, a man who reigned 3 times and even sold his holy office for a price. And we've marveled at the Renaissance court of Alexander VI, the Borgia pope who ran the church like a family business, a master of nepotism and murder, whose name would become a byword for corruption. These stories, so wild and so unbelievable, are not just dusty footnotes in a history book. They are a powerful, cautionary tale, a mirror reflecting the age-old struggle between the sacred and the profane, between faith and power. The popes we have discussed were not just men. They were the human face of an institution that was grappling with its own identity, struggling to reconcile its spiritual mission with the relentless demands of the temporal world. They were men who, blinded by ambition, personal greed, and the pursuit of political power, had forgotten their spiritual purpose. They had become kings of a worldly kingdom, and in doing so, they had almost destroyed the spiritual kingdom that they were meant to protect. Their stories serve as a stark reminder that even the most sacred of institutions can be corrupted by the fallible nature of human ambition. The scandals we've seen were the long, slow, and painful unraveling of a great institution. Each act of depravity, each scandal, each moment of moral failure was a drop of poison in a well of faith that had once been pure. The people of Europe, who had once looked to Rome for spiritual guidance, were now watching a spectacle of corruption, a drama of vice that made a mockery of their faith. The sale of indulgences, a seemingly small act in the grand scheme of things, was simply the final push, the last act of sacrilege that proved to a disillusioned populace that the church had lost its way. The people had seen enough. The illusion of holiness had been shattered, and the path was clear for a new spiritual movement to take hold. The Reformation was not a sudden event. It was the culmination of a deep-seated crisis, a spiritual revolution that was born from the ashes of papal scandal. Martin Luther's 95 Theses were not just a theological treatise. They were a thunderous cry of outrage, a voice that gave form to the unexpressed frustration and anger of a continent. The Protestant churches that emerged from this chaos were a direct result of the papacy's moral failings. They were a testament to the fact that when the spiritual is corrupted by the temporal, a new path will inevitably be forged. The unity of Christendom was shattered, and the world was forever changed. The papacy was forced to look inward, to undergo a painful and necessary period of reform, and to finally confront the moral rot that had been festering for centuries. The history of the scandalous popes is not just a tale of depravity and moral decay. It is a profound lesson in the consequences of unchecked power and the long, painful road to reform. It is a reminder that in the absence of piety, power corrupts absolutely, and that the greatest scandals are not just about the men who commit them, but about the institutions that allow them to flourish. It is a testament to the enduring power of faith, and a powerful warning that when an institution loses its way, the people will eventually rise up and demand something better. And in the end, that is the greatest lesson of all. The church survived, but it was changed forever, a constant reminder of the great price of its scandals. The story of the scandalous popes is a powerful, timeless narrative that continues to resonate today, a story that reminds us that no institution, no matter how powerful, can survive a crisis of morality without a fundamental and painful reckoning.